Resolved, the United States is justified in intervening in the internal political processes of other countries to attempt to stop human rights abuses. This was the topic last year at the City Club of Cleveland's annual high school debate championship, featuring Lincoln Douglas debate, a one-on-one form of debate centered on the morality and ethics of a value proposition. Each year, the City Club of Cleveland provides 2 high school debaters the opportunity to debate in a room historically renowned for celebrating the freedom of speech. As I researched the topic of human rights abuses in preparation for the debate, I reflected on the moral obligation of countries to protect human rights and the fundamental role human rights ought to play in foreign relations. I learned that despite such a moral obligation, it's easy to stand by as human rights are abused. It's easy to passively accept human suffering. This topic was personal for me because my father is serving a life sentence in a Chinese prison, branded a criminal by the Chinese government because of his work advocating for human rights. My journey to advocate for the release of my father and for human rights in China began just over 1 year ago with a debate topic that piqued my interest in learning about those rights and about my own father. I had always known that I am his mirror image and that we both share a love for the art of debate. But beyond that, I didn't really know who my father was. After all, the last memory I had of him was from 10 years ago. And so with Google searches and conversations with relatives, I gradually pieced together a timeline of my father's life and of my family's journey of escape to America. My father, Peng Ming, is an environmentalist, an economist, and a human rights activist. He is the author of The Fourth Landmark, a book on China's economic and political growth that was sponsored by the Ford Foundation. He was also the president and founder of the China Development Union, a think tank established to address the censored topics of human rights, free speech, and democracy. However, in 1999, the Chinese government shut down the think tank, sentenced my father to 18 months of labor camp. His crime? Passionately advocating for human rights and democracy in China. Upon his release, the government wiretapped our house, began following our car, and even threatened my father with a second arrest. It became too dangerous to continue living in China, and so we decided to flee political persecution. Our destination was Thailand, where we would apply for UN refugee status. I was 4 years old when we illegally crossed the Chinese border into Vietnam. A local guide directed us to a Vietnamese mountain village and managed our route into southern Vietnam. He also pointed out that our clothes made us too conspicuous, so he advised us to purchase local Vietnamese clothing. The first day, we traveled south on motorcycles. That evening, our guide handed us off to another guide who drove us further south in his van. Around midnight, 2 Vietnamese soldiers stopped us, hitched a free ride with us, and for what seemed like hours, sat right next to my mom and me in the back of the van. If at any point I had made any noise or spoken any Chinese, our identities would have been discovered. I distinctly remember my mom leaning over to me, whispering in my ear, "Stay silent, stay silent." Hours later, the soldiers finally stepped off the van and we proceeded to Hanoi. There we were handed off to another local guide who offered us his home for the night. The next morning, we were roughly tossed outside, after first being robbed of our money, of our identification, of everything. As if this were not bad enough, the stress and physical exhaustion we experienced caused my brother and me to become very sick. As we climbed the mountains, my mom grew noticeably weaker. Her pants were barely hanging on her hips as she gave whatever food she could find to my brother and me. We were all alone in a foreign country and had to forge our own path to Thailand, by foot, by bus, and by boat. After what had happened in Vietnam, we felt we could trust no one going forward, but we had no choice. We desperately needed help. And fortunately, there were some who stepped in to help us. A local Vietnamese woman saw us struggling to climb the mountains, and so she gave me a piggyback ride for part of our journey. We reached a hotel, and the desk clerks ended up letting us stay for the night, giving us food and medicine free of charge. The next morning, they put $200 in the bottom of our shoes and bid us farewell. But I will never forget those locals who did what they could to aid us in our moment of greatest need, who saved our lives, and who, by their small gestures, a free meal or a bed for the night, supported the cause for human rights in China. We eventually made it to Thailand, where we were granted UN refugee status. We were later accepted by the United States as well. On August 29, 2001, we landed in the United States, the land that stood for us as a beacon of freedom, democracy, and justice. For the first time, we experienced human rights and justice as values that weren't just confined to an underground think tank, but rather values that pervade the entire nation. In the United States, my father continued his human rights work. In 2004, he traveled to Thailand to establish a safe haven for political refugees. But he was then lured to Myanmar, kidnapped by secret Chinese police. The United Nations Working Group for Arbitrary Detention has determined that the deprivation of my father's liberty is in contravention to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Furthermore, my father was a US-based dissident with UN refugee status who escaped political persecution in China. Therefore, his kidnapping is in violation of the principle of non-refoulement, which forbids the return of the victim of persecution to his persecutor. My father was also arbitrarily deprived of his right to due process, as he was denied access to a lawyer and to a jury of his peers, rights that we take for granted. While I have been privileged to live and be educated in the United States, my father has been denied his human rights for the past 10 years. For me, it has been a decade of childhood memories, emotional growth, and intellectual maturity. But for him, it has been a decade of medical negligence, kidney disease, heart attacks, and torture. Although my father has remained in prison for the past 10 years, my father remains hopeful. In the letters that he writes to me, he writes about his habit of regularly exercising and reading, habits he developed when a free man, habits he maintains because he remains hopeful for his own freedom and for the freedom of his fellow countrymen. It is this hope that my father has instilled in me, despite the thousands of miles that have separated him from nearly a decade of my life, a decade during which I have been privileged to learn about democracy, freedom, and justice, but a decade during which my father has remained imprisoned for fighting to secure those very same values. As an American citizen, I cannot merely stand by as human rights atrocities continue to plague China. That Lincoln-Douglas debate resolution prompted my journey to discover who my father is and the values for which he stands. While I had the privilege to debate in a room that celebrates the freedom of speech, my father remains locked in a room built to stifle and punish prisoners of conscience. So in the past year, with members of Congress, I wrote an article in my father's story that was published by the Plain Dealer and the Taiwan Association for China Human Rights. And I testified before the Taiwan Parliament, the European Union Parliament, and the United States Congress to advocate for my father's freedom and for the freedom of the thousands of other political prisoners in China. My journey of advocacy started last year when a speech and debate teammate and I researched the issue of human rights abuses in China, and we learned about the China Aid Association, an organization that's dedicated to fighting for human rights and religious freedom in China. We invited Mr. Bob Fu, the founder and president of China Aid, to be a guest speaker at our school. Simultaneously, I have been logging every news article I could find about my father's case and organized everything into a comprehensive packet, and I sent it all to Mr. Bob Fu, despite there only being scattered pieces of information. Mr. Bob Fu was incredibly helpful to my efforts, and through his organization China Aid, arranged my first trip to Washington, D.C., where I introduced my father's case to members of Congress, to the State Department, and to Senator Sherrod Brown. It was also during that trip that China Aid, along with over 30 other human rights NGOs, launched the Free China 18 campaign, dedicated to seeking the freedom of 18 representative human rights dissidents who are arbitrarily deprived of their liberty in China. Although my father was a prominent political dissident and one of only 2 Chinese prisoners of conscience currently serving a life sentence in China, his case had fallen from the public eye in the 10 long years since his arrest. But as a result of my trip, my father has become one of the China 18. Although the adoption of my father's case by the Tom Lantos Defending Freedoms Commission has given me great hope for his release, I know that my father's case is only the tip of the iceberg. There remain thousands of prisoners of conscience and innocent Chinese civilians who continue to suffer the same denial of basic human freedoms. If I hadn't spoken up for my father, he would have had no chance of attaining his own freedom and the freedom of his fellow Chinese countrymen. If we don't speak up for human rights in China, there will remain no hope for the thousands of prisoners such as pro-democracy activists Dr. Wang Bingzhang, human rights lawyer Gao Zhisheng, and Nobel Peace Prize winner Liu Xiaobo. If we don't speak up, there will remain no hope for human rights in China, and activists like my father will continue to suffer. Sadly, the issue of human rights in China is one that's easily ignored in light of pressing economic concerns. China is, after all, the world's second largest economy and a major trading partner with the United States. Powerful economic interests want us to turn a blind eye to the human rights record in China. In difficult times, few relish jeopardizing America's economic recovery for the sake of human rights. Respecting America's values and standing up for human rights has never been easy, and it is not easy now. But isn't that what the promise of America is really about? Though I'm no politician or expert in this field, I have learned through Lincoln-Douglas debate that meaningful discussions on policy or course of action can only take place after a common value premise has been established. More than anything, debate has taught me that human rights are the foundation on which discussions of politics and economics must proceed. I've also realized that these principles aren't unique to Lincoln-Douglas debate. In fact, these are the very same values and fundamental freedoms on which our great country was founded. And as someone who was rescued, raised, and educated by this great nation, I feel that I owe it my utmost respect. However, respect and gratitude for one's country isn't demonstrated in passive acceptance of our country's actions, but in active scrutiny. We show our love and gratitude for our country by holding it to the highest of standards, the standards on which it was founded. My American education has taught me what those standards are, and this past year I have been trying to learn how to show gratitude to my country by asking it to live up to its stated ideals. Despite the 10 years that my father has remained imprisoned, I still remain hopeful, and through this process, I've learned that the issue of human rights isn't just political, it's personal. It's something on which every one of us can make an impact by taking seemingly small steps, whether they be a Vietnamese woman carrying a 4-year-old girl on her back, a hotel clerk giving food, medicine, and a place to stay overnight, a debate coach instilling values of morality, justice, and human rights into a student, or a fellow classmate who wants to join the China Human Rights Club at school and invite a human rights activist to be a guest speaker. Every individual and every action they take express their firm belief that human rights are worth fighting for, that we won't merely stand by as human rights continue to plague China, a country that will play a major role in determining the fate of the 21st century. This is why the fight isn't just political. It must be a personal commitment to speak up, something everyone, all of us, not just politicians, can live by. It is a refusal to remain silent. It's acting on the principles we read about in books or learn about in school. It is the efforts of my peers, teachers, and community around me who speak up and take a stand on human rights that give me hope for the future. They give me hope for the possibility of one day telling my father in person how much we have all cared about him and his dream for China's future. They give me hope for the possibility of one day securing human rights in China, for the possibility of one day paying the utmost respect to the values on which our great country was founded, the values for which I hope it will always stand. Thank you.